Sometimes a single moment of kindness can change everything. Sometimes helping a stranger becomes the most important thing you'll ever do in your life. Silas Boone was a mountain man who lived alone in the desert. He spent his days tracking wolves and running trap lines. He didn't talk much to people and liked it that way. One hot afternoon near Dead Mule Wash, he saw a young woman stuck in quicksand. She was sinking fast and fighting for her life. Silas threw her his rope and pulled her out. She didn't say a word, just looked at him with grateful eyes and walked away. He thought that was the end of it. 3 days later, dust clouds appeared on the ridge. The woman was back, but she wasn't alone. She had brought her entire tribe with her. But what happens when that stranger turns out to be a chief's daughter? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert had been Silas Boone's home for more years than most men could endure. At 57, his weathered hands told the story of a life lived outdoors, scars from wolf bites, burns from campfires, and calluses thick as leather from handling rope and steel traps. His cabin sat tucked into a narrow canyon 15 miles from the nearest settlement, hidden among red sandstone walls that provided shelter from the worst of the desert winds. Every morning before dawn, Silas would reach for his father's trapping journal, a leather-bound book so worn the cover had molded to the shape of his father's hands, then his own. The pages, yellowed with age and spotted with decades of use, contained everything his father had learned about surviving in this harsh land. Notes about water sources, animal habits, weather patterns, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be taught in schools back east. Water is life out here. Oh boy, his father used to say, and Silas could still hear that gravelly voice as clearly as if the old man were sitting beside him. Everything else is just details. The journal contained detailed maps of every reliable spring and seep within 100 miles, marked in his father's careful handwriting. Some entries went back 40 years, tracking how water sources changed with the seasons and the years. Silas had inherited more than just knowledge from his father. He'd inherited a way of looking at the world that valued silence over noise, substance over show. His father, Silas Boone, had come west after the war between the states, carrying nothing but his rifle, his rope, and a determination to find peace in the emptiness. He'd found that peace. And eventually a Navajo woman named Maria, who taught him as much about desert survival as he'd taught her about the ways of white men. The cabin reflected that blend of cultures and practical necessity. Adobe walls kept the interior cool during blazing summers and warm during bitter winter nights. Rough-hewn furniture built to last, not to impress. Shelves lined with glass jars containing dried herbs and medicines Maria had taught Jonas to prepare. Knowledge that had passed to Silas when his mother died of fever when he was barely 16. His daily routine hadn't changed much in 20 years. Up before first light, coffee black and strong from beans he traded for in town twice a year. Check the weather, study the journal for any notes about the day's planned territory. Load his pack with rope, water, dried meat, and the tools of his trade. Then out into the desert before the sun could turn the rocks into furnaces. Silas ran trap lines across 50 square miles of some of the most unforgiving country in the Southwest Territory. Not for beaver, those days had long passed, but for wolves and coyotes that threatened the scattered ranches and mining operations. The work required him to think like a predator, to understand how they moved through the landscape, where they denned, where they hunted. He moved through the desert like a ghost, reading sign that most men would never notice. A bent blade of grass might tell him a deer had passed 3 hours before. Scratches on a rock could reveal where a mountain lion had sharpened its claws. The angle of a track in soft sand would indicate whether an animal was hunting, fleeing, or simply traveling through its territory. The loneliness had stopped bothering him years ago. In fact, he'd grown to prefer it. People brought complications, expectations, disappointments. The desert was honest in its brutality. It didn't lie or make promises it couldn't keep. If you respected it and understood its rules, it would sustain you. If you didn't, it would kill you without malice or regret. His closest neighbors were the Hendersons, who ran a small ranch about 20 miles east. Good people, but Silas saw them maybe 3 times a year when their paths crossed at the trading post. There had been a time, years back, when Mary Henderson had made it clear she wouldn't mind more regular visits. She was a widow herself, her husband killed in a mining accident, trying to raise 2 boys on her own. But Silas had learned that opening your heart was like leaving water uncovered in the desert. Something would always come along to take it away. The trading post in Clearwater Springs served as his only regular contact with civilization. Every few months, he'd load his pack mule with wolf pelts and ride the 2-day journey to trade for supplies. Coffee, tobacco, ammunition, maybe a new book if the trader had something worth reading. The conversations were brief and practical. How were the wolf packs moving? Any new mines opening up that might need protection? Any news from back east that might affect the price of pelts? Silas preferred it that way. He'd grown up listening to his father's stories about the early days, when mountain men were kings of an endless wilderness. But that wilderness was shrinking every year. Telegraph lines crossed the desert now, and rumors of railroad surveys grew stronger each season. The mining camps were getting bigger, bringing more people who didn't understand the land or respect its power. On this particular morning, the morning that would change everything, Silas woke with an unusual restlessness. The feeling had been building for days, like the pressure before a thunderstorm. His instincts, honed by decades in the wilderness, told him something was different, though he couldn't identify what. The desert looked the same as always, endless red rock formations stretching to purple mountains on the horizon, sparse vegetation clinging to life wherever it could find purchase. The silence was complete, except for the distant cry of a hawk and the subtle whisper of wind through stone. But something felt off, like a note played slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect song. He'd planned to check his trap lines along the northern ridge, but the restless feeling pulled him toward Dead Mule Wash instead. The wash got its name from a cavalry patrol that had lost 3 pack animals to Quicksand 20 years before. It was treacherous country, full of hidden dangers, but it was also the most reliable water source for miles around. Animals came there to drink, which made it good hunting territory for both predators and trappers. Silas packed his gear with extra care that morning, including more rope than usual and additional water. His father had taught him to trust his instincts, even when, especially when, he couldn't explain them logically. The desert talks to those who know how to listen, Jonas used to say. Sometimes it whispers warnings, sometimes it offers opportunities, but it always has something to say to a man who's willing to hear. As he rode toward Dead Mule Wash on his sturdy Mustang, a horse as practical and unpretentious as everything else in his life, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that this day would be different. The horse seemed to sense it too, ears pricked forward, alert to something beyond normal awareness. The sun climbed higher, painting the rocks in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere ahead, destiny waited in the form of a young woman trapped in quicksand, though Silas had no way of knowing that yet. He only knew that after 20 years of predictable solitude, something was calling him toward an encounter that would challenge everything he thought he understood about his carefully ordered world. The journal tucked in his saddlebag contained his father's wisdom about survival, but nothing in those pages had prepared him for what was about to unfold at Dead Mule Wash. Sometimes life has lessons that can't be written down or passed along through words. Sometimes a man has to learn them in the moment, trusting his heart as much as his head, even when that heart had been deliberately hardened against hope and disappointment. The desert stretched endlessly around him, keeping its secrets for a little while longer. The heat struck Silas like a physical blow as he crested the ridge overlooking Dead Mule Wash. Even for late spring in the desert, the temperature was brutal, the kind of heat that could kill a man who wasn't careful with his water. The sun sat high and merciless in a sky bleached white by its own intensity, and the rocks below shimmered with waves of rising heat. Dead Mule Wash stretched out before him like a scar across the landscape. its sandy bottom marked by the meandering line of cottonwoods that indicated underground water. The wash had carved itself deep into the red sandstone over countless centuries, creating a natural corridor that wildlife used to move through the desert. It was also a death trap for the unwary. The sandy bottom concealed patches of quicksand that could swallow a horse and rider without warning. Silas guided his Mustang down the steep trail, reading the landscape with eyes trained by decades of experience. He noted fresh deer tracks in the sand, the territorial scratches of a mountain lion on a dead tree, and the scattered bones of some unfortunate creature that had learned too late about the hidden dangers beneath the innocent-looking surface. The cottonwoods provided blessed shade, and Silas dismounted to let his horse drink from the clear stream that bubbled up from an underground spring. The water was sweet and cold, filtered through miles of rock and sand. This was why he'd come, to check the water level and ensure his mental map of reliable sources remained accurate. In country this dry, knowing where to find water could mean the difference between life and death. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in the desert silence. A splash, followed by a cry of distress that was unmistakably human. The sound came from around a bend in the wash, maybe 200 yards downstream. Silas remounted quickly, his hand instinctively checking the coiled rope at his saddle. What he saw as he rounded the bend stopped him cold. A young woman was trapped in quicksand up to her waist, her arms stretched above her head as she fought against the relentless downward pull. She was clearly exhausted from the struggle, her movements becoming weaker and more desperate with each passing moment. But it wasn't just her predicament that struck Silas. It was everything about her that spoke of a world entirely different from his own. Her long black hair was adorned with intricate beadwork and feathers that marked her as belonging to one of the local tribes. Her clothing was beautifully crafted deerskin, decorated with patterns of turquoise and silver that caught the light even in her dire circumstances. Around her neck hung a necklace of carved bone and precious stones that would have been worth a fortune in any trading post. Most striking of all was her bearing. Even trapped and facing death, she carried herself with a dignity that suggested nobility. Her dark eyes met his without pleading or panic, though he could see the exhaustion and growing desperation behind their calm surface. This was someone accustomed to command, to respect, to being treated as more than an ordinary person. Silas didn't hesitate. 20 years of rope work had taught him to act fast in situations like this. He dismounted and quickly assessed the situation. The quicksand had her firmly in its grip, but she hadn't panicked and thrashed around like most people would. Her stillness had probably saved her life by preventing her from sinking deeper faster. "Don't move," he called out, though he wasn't sure she understood English. "Stay very still." He uncoiled his rope with practiced efficiency, testing the strength of the braided rawhide that had saved his life more times than he could count. The lariat was 60 feet long and thick enough to hold a struggling bull. It would be more than sufficient for this rescue if he could get it to her and find solid anchor points. The challenge was the distance and the need for precision. He had maybe one good throw before the angle became too difficult. Silas studied the terrain, noting a sturdy cottonwood behind him that could serve as an anchor point. He secured one end of the rope around the tree, then measured out the distance carefully. "Catch this," he called, hoping she understood his intent, if not his words. He threw the rope with the skill of a man who had roped everything from wolves to wild horses. The loop sailed through the air and landed perfectly within her reach. The young woman grabbed the rope with both hands, her movements showing she understood what needed to happen next. Silas braced himself against the cottonwood and began to pull, using the tree as a fulcrum to multiply his strength. The quicksand fought back, reluctant to give up its prey, but Silas had patience and technique on his side. Inch by inch, he worked her free. The process took nearly 20 minutes of careful, steady pressure. Too much force too quickly could injure her or cause the rope to slip from her grip. Too little and the quicksand would maintain its hold. It was a delicate balance that required all of his experience and concentration. When she finally came free with a wet, sucking sound, both of them were exhausted. Silas pulled her to solid ground and helped her sit in the shade of the cottonwoods. She was covered in mud and sand, but otherwise seemed unharmed. For several minutes, they both simply sat and caught their breath. Up close, Silas could see even more details that spoke of her high status. The beadwork on her clothing was incredibly intricate, the kind of artistry that took months to complete. Her hands, though now muddy, were soft and uncalloused, not the hands of someone who did manual labor. The jewelry she wore included pieces that were clearly ceremonial, made from materials that had been traded from far away. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried an authority that confirmed his suspicions about her importance. She spoke in what Silas recognized as Chiricahua Apache, though he understood only a few words. Her tone was formal, respectful, and clearly meant to convey gratitude. She reached into a small pouch at her waist and withdrew something that made Silas's breath catch. It was a bracelet made of turquoise and silver, the craftsmanship so fine it seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight. The stones were perfect specimens, the kind that traders would fight over. She held it out to him with both hands, speaking again in her native language. Silas shook his head and gently pushed her hands back. "No need for that," he said, not sure if she understood, but hoping his tone conveyed his meaning. "Just glad you're safe." The young woman studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to take measure of his character. Then she did something unexpected. She removed the bracelet and placed it carefully on a flat rock beside the stream before standing gracefully and walking away. She moved with the fluid steps of someone who belonged in this harsh landscape, disappearing around the bend in the wash as silently as a shadow. Silas sat for a long time after she was gone, staring at the turquoise bracelet glinting in the afternoon sun. Everything about the encounter felt significant in ways he couldn't quite understand. The woman's obvious high status, her composure in the face of death, the formal way she had offered payment, and his instinctive refusal. It all felt like part of some larger pattern he couldn't see yet. Eventually, he picked up the bracelet and studied it more closely. The turquoise stones were flawless, the silver work incredibly detailed. Each element had been crafted with the kind of care that spoke of deep cultural significance. This wasn't just jewelry. It was art, history, and spiritual meaning, all combined into one beautiful object. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Silas mounted his horse and headed home. But the feeling of restlessness that had driven him to Dead Mule Wash that morning had intensified rather than diminished. Something told him this encounter was just the beginning, not the end, of whatever was unfolding in his carefully ordered world. The turquoise bracelet rode secure in his saddlebag, but its weight seemed to be far greater than its actual substance. Like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples of this afternoon's events were spreading outward in ways Silas couldn't yet imagine. The first day after the rescue passed without incident, but Silas found himself checking the horizon more often than usual. The turquoise bracelet sat on his kitchen table, catching the morning light that filtered through his single window. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of the young woman's dignified bearing and the formal way she had offered it as payment. There had been something ceremonial about the entire encounter, as if it were part of some ritual he didn't understand. By the second day, Silas noticed subtle changes in his territory that set his nerves on edge. His Mustang acted skittish near certain areas, ears constantly swiveling as if listening for sounds beyond normal hearing. Birds seemed fewer and more quiet than usual. Even the coyotes, who typically announced their presence with evening songs, had gone silent. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour. Silas had survived this long in dangerous country by trusting his instincts, and every sense he possessed told him he was no longer alone in his domain. Someone, or several someones, was observing him from a distance, studying his movements and habits. On the morning of the third day, as he stepped outside his cabin to check the weather, Silas found the first concrete evidence that his feelings were justified. There, placed with careful precision on the flat rock beside his door, lay a single eagle feather. The feather was magnificent, nearly a foot long, with perfect barring and no sign of damage. It had been placed point first toward his door, arranged with the kind of deliberate care that suggested deep meaning. Silas picked up the feather and examined it closely. Eagle feathers were sacred to most of the southwestern tribes, not given lightly or casually. Finding one placed so deliberately at his door was clearly a message, though he wasn't sure he understood its meaning. Was it a gift? A warning? A sign of respect or challenge? His father's journal contained some notes about tribal customs, gleaned from conversations with Maria and other native people Jonas had encountered over the years. Silas flipped through the pages until he found the relevant sections. According to his father's observations, eagle feathers were often used to mark important events or to show respect for brave actions. They were also sometimes used by scouts to indicate their presence to those they were watching. The implications made Silas's skin crawl with unease. If tribal scouts were watching him, it meant the young woman he'd rescued was indeed someone of importance, important enough to warrant careful observation of the man who had saved her life. The formal way she had offered the bracelet, her obvious noble bearing, the quality of her clothing and jewelry, it all pointed to her being much more than just another traveler. Silas spent the rest of that day trying to spot his watchers, using every tracking skill his father had taught him. He found signs, the impression of a moccasin in soft sand near his water source, a place where someone had knelt behind rocks to observe his cabin, bent grass that indicated passage of someone moving carefully to avoid detection. But he never caught sight of the watchers themselves, which told him they were skilled at their craft. The game of hunter and hunted continued through the following days. Silas would find small signs of their presence. A stone moved from its natural position, tracks that appeared and disappeared on hard ground, smoke from a distant fire that vanished when he tried to locate its source. His observers were clearly professionals, trained from childhood in the arts of stealth and surveillance. Despite his growing unease, Silas maintained his normal routines. He checked his traplines, repaired equipment, and performed the daily tasks that had structured his life for 20 years. But now every action was performed with the knowledge that unknown eyes were watching, evaluating, perhaps judging his character and intentions. The isolation he had treasured for so long began to feel different, not peaceful, but oppressive. The silence that had once comforted him now seemed full of hidden meanings. Every sound made him alert, every shadow could conceal a watcher. Sleep became elusive as he found himself listening for sounds that shouldn't be there. On the 5th day, Silas discovered that his observers had grown bolder. Fresh tracks around his cabin indicated that someone had approached during the night, close enough to look through his windows. The thought of being watched while he slept filled him with a mixture of anger and apprehension. His sanctuary had been violated, his privacy invaded by people whose intentions remained unclear, but there was something else in the tracks that gave him pause. Mixed in with the moccasin prints were the smaller tracks of what appeared to be a woman, delicate feet in soft-soled shoes, moving with the same careful precision as the others. The rescued woman had returned with her watchers, or perhaps she had never really left at all that evening. As Silas sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, a deliberately visible activity meant to send a message about his readiness to defend himself, he caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge above his cabin. Just for a moment, silhouetted against the setting sun, he saw the figure of a rider on horseback. The figure was too distant to make out details, but something about the posture and bearing reminded him of the young woman from Dead Mule Wash. The sighting lasted only seconds before the rider disappeared behind the rocks, but it confirmed what Silas had begun to suspect. This wasn't random surveillance by hostile scouts. This was something more complex, more ceremonial perhaps. The woman he had rescued was indeed someone of great importance, and his act of rescue had set in motion events that followed rules he didn't understand. That night, Silas found himself studying the turquoise bracelet by lamplight, turning it over in his weathered hands as he tried to decode its significance. The craftsmanship was beyond anything he had seen before, each turquoise stone cut and polished to perfection, the silver work showing a mastery that spoke of generations of inherited skill. This was not trade jewelry made for tourists or casual exchange. This was an artifact of deep cultural meaning, perhaps ceremonial in nature. As he prepared for bed, checking and double-checking the security of his cabin, Silas realized that his old life was already gone. The careful solitude he had constructed was crumbling, replaced by something unknown and potentially dangerous. The young woman's gratitude had somehow obligated him to participate in customs and traditions he didn't understand, with people whose intentions remained mysterious. But despite his apprehension, Silas felt a strange stirring of something he had thought long dead: curiosity about other people, interest in their ways and customs. For 20 years, he had deliberately shut himself off from human connection, believing it led only to disappointment and loss. Now, whether he wanted it or not, connection was coming to find him. The eagle feather lay on his table beside the bracelet, two artifacts that linked him to a world beyond his canyon walls. Tomorrow would bring new signs, new watchers, new questions about what was expected of him. But tonight, for the first time in years, Silas Boone fell asleep wondering what the dawn might bring instead of dreading it. On the 6th day, Silas discovered that his invisible watchers had left him a gift that changed everything. Beside his morning coffee pot, placed with the same careful precision as the eagle feather, lay a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork. The leather was soft as silk, dyed a rich brown that spoke of expert craftsmanship. The beadwork depicted a pattern of eagles in flight, worked in blues and whites that seemed to shimmer in the early morning light. Inside the pouch, Silas found something that made his breath catch: a small piece of parchment with writing in a careful, educated hand. The words were in English, written with obvious care by someone for whom it was not a native language. "The daughter of Chief Red Elk thanks the man with the good heart. She asks permission to bring her father's gratitude to your fire." Silas read the note 3 times, each reading revealing new implications. The young woman he had rescued was not just tribal nobility. She was the daughter of Chief Red Elk, one of the most respected and powerful Chiricahua Apache leaders in the territory. Red Elk was legendary among both his people and the white settlers, known for his wisdom in council and his fierce protection of Apache rights and lands. More surprising was the evidence that the chief's daughter could read and write English. This suggested contact with missionaries, or perhaps time spent at one of the Indian schools back east. It also explained the formal tone of the message. She was bridging 2 worlds, using the language and customs of both to communicate her intentions. The phrase, "bring her father's gratitude to your fire," carried deep meaning in Apache culture, as Silas knew from his father's notes. Sharing fire was one of the most sacred forms of hospitality, reserved for honored guests and important ceremonies. If Chief Red Elk wanted to visit his fire, it meant Silas had unknowingly participated in something far more significant than a simple rescue. But it was the request for permission that troubled him most. In his experience, Apache warriors took what they wanted and didn't ask permission from isolated mountain men. The fact that they were requesting rather than demanding suggested that his rescue of the chief's daughter had elevated him to some special status that required respect rather than conquest. Silas spent the morning pacing his small cabin, torn between curiosity and caution. Part of him, the part that had inherited his father's fascination with different cultures, wanted to say yes, to learn more about these people who lived so differently, yet survived in the same harsh landscape. But another part, the part that had chosen isolation after too many disappointments, urged him to pack up and move deeper into the wilderness. The decision was complicated by practical considerations. Chief Red Elk commanded respect among all the tribes in the region. Having his friendship could mean safety for Silas as he traveled his trap lines. but it could also mark him as an enemy to those who opposed the Apache, including some of the more aggressive mining operations and cavalry units that saw all Indians as threats to be eliminated. As the day wore on, Silas found himself thinking about his father's stories. Jonas Boone had always spoken respectfully of the native peoples he'd encountered, praising their knowledge of the land and their complex understanding of how to live in harmony with the desert. Maria, Silas's mother, had taught Jonas as much about survival as he had ever learned from white men. Their relationship had been built on mutual respect and shared knowledge, rather than the fear and suspicion that seemed to dominate most interactions between the races. By afternoon, Silas had made his decision. He took a piece of paper from his meager supplies and wrote a careful response. Silas Boone welcomes Chief Red Elk and his daughter to share his fire. The honor is mine. He placed the note in the beaded pouch and set it on the same rock where he had found it, weighted down with a small stone to prevent the desert wind from carrying it away. The next morning, the pouch was gone, replaced by a single turkey feather, a sign, according to his father's journal, of acceptance and peaceful intentions. Silas felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety as he realized there was no turning back now. Whatever was coming would test everything he thought. He knew about himself and his place in this harsh but beautiful land. He spent the following days preparing for visitors, in ways he hadn't considered in 20 years. His cabin was clean but sparse, designed for one man's simple needs rather than hospitality. He had no proper chairs, no table large enough for more than one person, no supplies for cooking a meal worthy of a chief's dignity, but more challenging than the physical preparations was the emotional work of opening himself to human connection after decades of deliberate isolation. Silas found himself practicing conversations in his head, wondering what one talked about with Apache royalty, worrying about cultural missteps that might give offense. His nervousness increased when he began noticing more signs of activity in his territory. Smoke from distant fires appeared and disappeared on the horizon. His horse grew increasingly restless, pawing the ground and nickering at sounds Silas couldn't hear. Birds that had been absent during the surveillance period began returning, but in different patterns than before, as if the very nature of the land was shifting. On the 10th day after the rescue, as Silas was checking his snares near the spring that fed his water supply, he found fresh tracks that made his heart race. Multiple horses moving in formation, with the disciplined spacing that indicated experienced riders rather than casual travelers. Mixed among the horse tracks were those same small, careful footprints he had noticed before. The chief's daughter was returning, and she wasn't coming alone. The tracks were fresh, perhaps only hours old, which meant the delegation was close. Silas hurried back to his cabin to make final preparations, his mind racing with questions about protocol and expectations. How should he greet a chief? What gifts would be appropriate? What if his crude frontier manners gave offense to people who had every right to consider him an intruder on their ancestral lands? As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert rocks in shades of gold and crimson, Silas sat on his porch and waited. Somewhere out there, moving toward his small canyon, came Chief Red Elk and his daughter, bringing with them the possibility of friendship or conflict, understanding or misunderstanding. The carefully constructed solitude of 20 years was about to end, replaced by something unknown and potentially transformative. Whatever happened next would determine not just his immediate safety, but the entire direction of his remaining years. The dust clouds appeared on the eastern ridge, just as the sun touched the tops of the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to set the entire desert ablaze. Silas counted the riders as they became visible, 7 figures on horseback, moving with the fluid grace that marked them as people born to the saddle. Even at a distance, there was something majestic about their approach, as if the land itself was welcoming them home. Leading the group was a figure that commanded attention even from afar. Chief Red Elk sat his horse with the bearing of a man accustomed to respect and authority, his presence somehow making him appear larger than his actual size. His long grey hair flowed freely over shoulders, draped in what appeared to be a magnificent ceremonial shirt. Even from a quarter-mile away, Silas could sense the power and dignity that had made Red Elk legendary among both his people and their enemies. Beside the chief rode the young woman Silas had rescued, and seeing her now in context made her true status unmistakably clear. She was dressed in garments that must have taken months to create, buckskin so soft it seemed to flow like water, decorated with beadwork and quillwork that caught the fading light like captured stars. Her bearing was every bit as regal as her father's, a princess of the desert returning to complete, unfinished business. The other riders were clearly warriors of high status, their weapons and regalia marking them as the chief's personal guard. They moved in formation that spoke of military discipline and long practice, but there was nothing threatening in their approach. This was a ceremonial delegation, not a war party. Silas stood on his porch, acutely aware of his own rough appearance compared to the magnificence approaching his humble cabin. His clothes were practical frontier wear, leather and homespun that prioritized durability over appearance. His cabin, built for survival rather than comfort, seemed suddenly shabby when measured against the grandeur of his approaching guests, but his father's teachings echoed in his memory. Dignity ain't about fancy clothes or big houses, boy. It's about how you treat others and how you carry yourself. When times get tough, Silas straightened his shoulders and waited with quiet confidence as the delegation descended into his canyon. Chief Red Elk dismounted, with fluid grace despite his obvious years, his movements still showing the strength and agility that had made him a formidable warrior in his youth. Up close, he was an imposing figure, tall and lean, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His face was weathered by decades of desert sun and wind, marked with lines that spoke of laughter as well as sorrow, wisdom earned through experience rather than inherited through privilege. The chief's daughter dismounted beside her father, and Silas was struck again by her remarkable presence. Clean and properly dressed, she was even more beautiful than he had realized, but it was her bearing rather than her appearance that commanded attention. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, yet there was humility in her manner as she approached the man who had saved her life. "I am Red Elk," the chief said in careful but clear English, his voice carrying the resonant authority of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. "You saved the life of my daughter, Ayana. For this, you have my gratitude and the friendship of my people." The chief's use of English surprised Silas. He had expected to need gestures and his few words of Apache to communicate. Red Elk's pronunciation was formal and slightly stilted, suggesting education rather than casual contact with white culture. This was a man who understood the importance of communication across cultural boundaries. "Name's Silas Boone," he replied, extending his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting. "I was glad to help. Any man would have done the same." Red Elk clasped his hand firmly, studying Silas's face with eyes that seemed to look directly into his soul. "Not any man," the chief said quietly. "Many would have ridden past, unwilling to risk themselves for a stranger. You stopped. You acted. This speaks of your character." Ayana stepped forward and spoke to her father in rapid Apache, her tone respectful but urgent. Red Elk listened carefully, then nodded and turned back to Silas. "My daughter wishes to return the bracelet she left for you. She says it was improper to leave. Payment for an act of honor." The young woman reached into a beautifully beaded pouch and withdrew the turquoise bracelet Silas had found at Dead Mule Wash. But instead of simply handing it to him, she approached with the same formal bearing she had shown during their first encounter. She spoke in Apache, her words clearly ritual in nature, then offered the bracelet with both hands. Silas looked between father and daughter, sensing that his response would be significant beyond the simple return of an object. "If it's all the same to you both," he said carefully, "I'd like to keep it. not as payment, but as a reminder of how sometimes doing right leads to unexpected blessings. Red Elk translated Silas's words to his daughter, whose face lit up with what appeared to be genuine delight. She responded with a stream of Apache that made her father chuckle, the first time Silas had seen the stern chief show any emotion beyond formal dignity. She says you have the wisdom to understand gifts of the heart, Red Elk explained. She asks if she may know the name of the man who saved her life. Silas Boone, he replied, looking directly at Ayana. And I'm honored to know yours, miss. Ayana, she said in English, her voice soft but clear. It means eternal blossom in our language. The formal introductions complete, an awkward silence fell over the group. Silas realized that as host, the next move was his to make, but he had no experience with entertaining Apache royalty. His father's journal had mentioned the importance of hospitality in native cultures, but provided no specific guidance for this situation. I don't have much, he said finally, but you're welcome to share what I've got. Coffee's fresh, and I've got some deer meat that might make a decent meal if you folks aren't too particular. Red Elk's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. A man's wealth is not measured by his possessions, but by his willingness to share them. We would be honored to accept your hospitality. As the chief's warriors made camp in the level area near Silas's cabin, setting up their arrangements with efficient precision, Silas found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. This was clearly more than a simple thank you visit. There was purpose and ceremony in everything these people did, suggesting larger intentions that he didn't yet understand. The evening meal became something far more significant than Silas had anticipated. What he had imagined as a simple sharing of food transformed into an elaborate ceremony that revealed the true depth of Apache culture and the profound meaning behind their visit. Red Elk had produced a beautifully carved wooden pipe from his personal belongings, a sacred object that spoke of generations of careful use and reverence. The pipe bowl was fashioned from red stone that seemed to glow in the firelight, decorated with silver inlay work that matched the quality of Ayana's jewelry. The stem was wrapped in soft leather and adorned with eagle feathers and beadwork that told stories Silas could only guess at. This pipe belonged to my grandfather and his grandfather before him, Red Elk explained as he carefully prepared it with a mixture of tobacco and aromatic herbs. It has been smoked in council with great chiefs, carried into battle by brave warriors, and used to seal treaties that shape the destiny of our people. Tonight, we smoke it in friendship, with a man who proved that honor exists in all races, the ceremony of lighting and sharing. The pipe was conducted with a solemnity that made Silas acutely aware of the sacred nature of what was happening. Red Elk offered smoke to the four directions, speaking prayers in Apache that seemed to connect the small gathering to something vast and eternal. When the pipe was passed to Silas, he felt the weight of centuries of tradition in his hands. As they shared the evening meal, Silas's simple deer stew enhanced by herbs and spices the Apache had brought, the conversation revealed depths of understanding that surprised them all. Red Elk spoke of his people's history in this land, stories that went back generations before any white man had ever seen the desert. He talked of sacred places hidden in the mountains, of water sources known only to his people, of the delicate balance required to live in harmony with such unforgiving country. Your father knew some of our ways, Red Elk said, studying Silas carefully in the firelight. Ayana tells me you have the look of a man who learned from his elders. Your rescue of my daughter showed wisdom as well as courage. You did not hesitate, but you also did not act carelessly. Silas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told in years, memories of his father's teachings, his mother's gentle wisdom, the gradual process by which he had learned to read the desert's moods and seasons. The Apache listened with the deep attention of people who understood the value of inherited knowledge. Nodding at familiar truths about survival and respect for the land, Ayana contributed to the conversation in a mixture of Apache and carefully chosen English words, her intelligence and education becoming more apparent with each exchange. She had clearly spent time learning about white culture, but her questions revealed genuine curiosity rather than mere academic interest. "Why do you live alone?" she asked during a lull in the conversation, her directness catching Silas off guard. "In our culture, solitude is for mourning or seeking visions, but you have made it a way of life." The question forced Silas to examine motivations he had never fully articulated, even to himself. "I reckon I got tired of disappointment," he said finally. "People let you down, and after a while it seemed easier to avoid the whole mess." Red Elk studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. "Disappointment is the price we pay for caring," he said quietly. "But it is also proof that we are capable of love. A man who feels no disappointment has stopped expecting anything good from life." The conversation continued late into the night, ranging from practical matters of desert survival to philosophical questions about the relationship between different peoples sharing the same land. Silas learned that Red Elk was facing pressures from his own people to take a harder stance against white encroachment, while also dealing with government officials who seemed determined to force all Apache onto distant reservations. "I am caught between two fires," the chief admitted. "Young warriors want to fight, believing they can drive out all white men and return to the old ways. Government men want us to give up our lands and live like farmers on soil that will not grow corn. Both paths lead to the destruction of my people." The weight of Red Elk's burden was evident in his voice, the burden of a leader trying to navigate between impossible choices while preserving what remained of his people's way of life. Silas began to understand that this visit was about more than gratitude for his daughter's rescue. Red Elk was exploring the possibility of finding allies among the white population, men who might bridge the gap between cultures. As the fire burned low and the desert night settled around them, Red Elk made an offer that changed everything. "My people know this land as no others do," he said. "We know where water flows beneath the sand, where game gathers in winter, where storms strike and where they do not. This knowledge could be valuable to a man who lives as you do." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "But knowledge shared creates bonds between people. If you were to learn our ways, you would become part of our story, and we would become part of yours. This is not something to be undertaken lightly." Silas felt the magnitude of what was being offered. Red Elk was proposing nothing less than adoption into Apache culture, a sharing of secrets that had been guarded for generations. But such knowledge would come with obligations and loyalties that could put him at odds with his own people. "I need time to think on this," Silas said carefully. "It's a generous offer, more generous than I probably deserve. But once a man changes his path, there's no going back to where he was before." Red Elk nodded approvingly. "Wisdom speaks before pride answers. Think well, Silas Boone, but know this. My offer comes not just from gratitude, but from recognition of your character. You are already more Apache in your heart than many white men could ever be." As the Apache delegation prepared their sleeping arrangements, Silas found himself staring up at the star-filled desert sky, his mind racing with possibilities and implications. The simple rescue of a stranger had opened doors he had never imagined, offering a future that was both promising and terrifying. The sacred pipe lay carefully wrapped beside Red Elk's sleeping roll, its presence a reminder that some decisions carry weight far beyond their immediate consequences. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new revelations, and perhaps new understanding of what it meant to live with honor in a land where cultures collided and sometimes, miraculously, found common ground. The morning brought visitors that changed everything. Silas woke to the sound of his Mustang nickering nervously and the Apache horses stamping restlessly in their makeshift corral. Red Elk was already awake, standing motionless as he studied the eastern horizon where a new dust cloud was approaching, this one larger and moving with the aggressive purposefulness of men on urgent business. Cavalry, Red Elk said quietly, his weathered face showing no emotion despite the potential danger. A full patrol, perhaps 20 men. They moved like hunters following a trail. Silas felt his stomach clench with dread. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Somehow, someone had learned of the Apache delegation's visit to his cabin and reported it to the military authorities. In the current political climate, with tensions rising between the government and the Apache tribes, such a meeting could be interpreted as conspiracy or worse. "They're probably tracking you," Silas said, reaching for his rifle. "Looking for evidence that you're planning something against the settlements." Red Elk's expression remained calm, but Silas caught the brief glance he exchanged with his warriors. "Perhaps," the chief said. "Or perhaps they seek something else entirely." The approaching cavalry patrol came into clear view as they crested the ridge overlooking Silas's canyon. At their head rode a figure that made Silas's blood run cold. Captain William Morrison, a man whose hatred of all native peoples was legendary throughout the territory. Morrison had built his career on aggressive campaigns against Apache bands, caring little whether his targets were warriors or peaceful families. Behind Morrison rode his hand-picked men, soldiers who shared their captain's views about the Indian problem and its proper solution. These were not peacekeepers, but rather men who saw every Apache as an enemy to be eliminated. The fact that they had come here, to Silas's remote canyon, suggested knowledge of the meeting that could only have come from a spy or informant. As the patrol descended into the canyon, Morrison's arrogant bearing became more apparent. He was a small man who compensated for his size with bluster and cruelty, the type who found courage only when backed by superior numbers and firepower. His pale blue eyes swept over the Apache camp with obvious satisfaction, as if he had just confirmed his worst suspicions. "Well, well," Morrison called out as he reined in his horse near Silas's cabin. "Silas Boone consorting with hostile Indians? This is an interesting development that certain authorities will want to hear about." "These folks are my guests, Captain," Silas replied evenly, though his hand remained near his rifle. "Last I checked, hospitality wasn't a crime in this territory." Morrison dismounted with theatrical flourish, his hand resting on his saber hilt. "Hospitality to known enemies of the United States government could be considered treason. Boone, especially when those enemies include Red Elk, who has been particularly troublesome to our efforts to maintain peace." Red Elk stepped forward with dignified calm, showing no fear despite being outnumbered 3-1. "I am here in peace, Captain Morrison. My daughter's life was saved by this man, and I came to offer proper thanks according to our customs." "Your customs," Morrison sneered, "include murdering innocent settlers and burning their homes. Don't expect me to believe this touching story about gratitude and rescue. It was then that Ayana made a decision that stunned everyone present." She reached into her decorated pouch and withdrew not another piece of Apache craftswork, but a small leather journal bound with a brass clasp. The journal was clearly of military issue, and when she opened it, the pages were covered with detailed notes written in a precise, educated hand. "Captain Morrison," she said in perfect, unaccented English that revealed education far beyond what any of them had suspected. "Perhaps you should examine this before making accusations about our intentions." She handed the journal to Morrison, whose expression changed from arrogant confidence to growing alarm as he read the entries. Silas caught glimpses of the pages and saw what appeared to be detailed maps, lists of troop movements, and notes about military supply schedules. "Where did you get this?" Morrison demanded, his voice rising with barely controlled panic. "From Lieutenant Bradley's saddlebags, after he was killed in the ambush near Copper Creek," Ayana replied with chilling calm. "The same ambush that your informant told you was being planned by my father's warriors." The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow. Ayana wasn't just Chief Red Elk's daughter. She was an intelligence operative, someone who had been tracking military movements and uncovering evidence of corruption within the territorial command. The rescue at Dead Mule Wash hadn't been an accident, but rather the result of her intelligence work in dangerous territory. Morrison's face had gone pale as he continued reading the journal. Whatever he found there clearly implicated him in activities that went far beyond his legitimate military duties. His hands actually trembled as he turned the pages, seeing his own schemes laid out in documented detail. This journal contains evidence of your arrangement with mining interests to provoke conflicts with Apache bands, Ayana continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone revealing long-planned evidence. It documents payments made to you for ensuring that hostile incidents occurred near valuable mineral deposits, giving the mining companies legal justification to claim traditional Apache lands. Red Elk stepped closer to his daughter, and Silas could see the pride and fierce protectiveness in the chief's eyes. This was no ordinary rescue scenario. It was the culmination of a complex intelligence operation that had been months in the planning. You've been using Lieutenant Bradley to coordinate with Apache renegades who were willing to attack settlers for money, Ayana explained to the stunned Morrison, creating incidents that would justify military retaliation against innocent bands while enriching both yourself and your mining company partners. Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, but found himself facing not just Red Elk's warriors, but also Silas, whose rifle was now trained directly on the captain's chest. The tables had turned completely. The hunters had become the hunted, and the evidence of Morrison's corruption was documented in his own lieutenant's handwriting. The territorial governor is already aware of these activities, Red Elk said quietly. Copies of this journal have been delivered to authorities in Santa Fe. Your career is finished, Captain Morrison. But Morrison was far from finished fighting. His eyes darted between the Apache warriors and Silas, calculating odds and possibilities. Even if that's true, he said with desperate cunning, you're all still here in violation of territorial law. Red Elk is off the reservation without permission, meeting with a known sympathizer. That's enough to justify immediate action. The standoff that followed was electric with tension. Morrison's soldiers, confused by the rapid turn of events, looked between their captain and the Apache warriors, with uncertain hands hovering near their weapons. Everyone present understood that the next few moments would determine whether this confrontation ended in justice or bloodshed. Silas found himself at the center of a conflict that transcended his simple mountain man existence. The young woman he had rescued from Quicksand was actually an Apache intelligence agent whose work threatened to expose a network of corruption that reached deep into the territorial government. The grateful father who had come to thank him was one of the most hunted men in the Southwest, carrying evidence that could reshape the balance of power between his people and their oppressors. The turquoise bracelet on Silas's wrist suddenly carried new meaning. It wasn't just a symbol of gratitude, but also a mark of trust from people who had risked everything to gather evidence of injustice. His simple act of rescue had drawn him into the center of a complex web of politics, corruption, and the struggle for survival that defined life on the frontier. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with every man present calculating the odds of survival in the deadly equation that had suddenly developed. Morrison's soldiers were good fighters, but they were facing Apache warriors on their home ground, plus a mountain man who knew every inch of the surrounding terrain. More importantly, they were beginning to understand that their captain had led them into a situation that went far beyond their understanding. Silas could see doubt creeping into the soldiers' faces as they processed what they had heard about Morrison's corruption. These were career military men who had signed up to serve their country, not to enrich crooked officers and mining speculators. The revelation that their captain had been orchestrating attacks on civilians to benefit his financial partners was clearly shaking their loyalty. Sergeant Williams. Morrison barked at his second-in-command, trying to reassert control over his deteriorating situation. Arrest these Indians for violation of territorial law and this civilian for harboring enemies of the state. But Sergeant Williams, a grizzled veteran with 20 years of frontier service, made no move to follow the order. Instead, he stepped closer to examine the journal that still lay open in Morrison's trembling hands. What he saw there made his weathered face harden with disgust. "Captain," William said carefully, "maybe we should hear these folks out before we do anything we might regret. That journal looks mighty official, and if what they're saying is true, are you questioning my orders, Sergeant?" Morrison's voice rose to a near shriek, revealing the panic beneath his bluster. "I'll have you court-martialed for insubordination." "With respect, sir," Williams replied, "a court-martial might be exactly what this situation needs. But not for me." The defection of his senior sergeant seemed to break something inside Morrison. His face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that his carefully constructed web of corruption was unraveling before his eyes. With the quick, dangerous movements of a cornered animal, he drew his service revolver and pointed it directly at Ayana. Maybe the Apache princess would like to explain how she came to possess classified military documents. Morrison snarled. Or maybe she'd prefer to die with her secrets intact. The threat against his daughter transformed Red Elk from a dignified chief into something far more dangerous. The change was subtle but unmistakable, a predatory stillness that made the desert air itself seem to hold its breath. Around him, his warriors shifted into combat positions with fluid, practiced movements that spoke of countless battles fought and won. But it was Silas who moved first, stepping between Morrison's gun and Ayana with the calm deliberation of a man who had made peace with whatever consequences might follow. "Put the weapon down, Captain," he said quietly. "This has gone far enough." "Get out of my way, Boone," Morrison warned, "or you'll be the first to die." Silas didn't move. "I've lived 57 years, he said with remarkable calm. "Most of them good years, honest years. If they end today defending people who showed me honor and friendship, I reckon that's not such a bad way to go." Behind Morrison, his soldiers were beginning to distance themselves from their captain's increasingly erratic behavior. Several had their hands near their weapons, but not in preparation to support Morrison, rather in readiness to stop him if necessary. The revelation of his corruption had shattered their trust, and his threatening of a woman had completed their moral break from his leadership. Ayana spoke into the tense silence, her voice carrying an authority that somehow seemed to command attention even at gunpoint. "Captain Morrison, you should know that the evidence against you extends far beyond Lieutenant Bradley's journal. We have documented testimony from 3 of your co-conspirators, including detailed accounts of payments received and operations planned." She reached slowly into her pouch, careful not to make any sudden movements that might trigger violence, and withdrew a small stack of papers bound with official-looking seals. "These are sworn statements from mining executives who have been cooperating with territorial investigators for the past month. Your entire operation has been under surveillance since February." Morrison's gun hand began to shake as the full scope of his exposure became clear. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There's no way you could have..." "Could have what?" Red Elk interjected, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. "Could have outmaneuvered a corrupt officer who thought Apache people were too primitive to understand white man's duplicity. Could have gathered evidence while you were busy counting your illegal profits." The chief's words carried the weight of someone who had been planning this moment for months, preparing for the confrontation with the methodical patience that had made him legendary among his people. This wasn't a chance encounter, it was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated intelligence operation. "My daughter speaks 4 languages and has studied at the Territorial University under an assumed name," Red Elk continued, his voice carrying quiet pride. "She understands your legal system better than most of your own lawyers. Did you really think you could conduct criminal conspiracies without eventually attracting the attention of people who had every reason to investigate your activities?" Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his decision clearly made. "Captain Morrison, I'm placing you under military arrest pending investigation of these charges. Hand over your weapon." "You can't do this," Morrison screamed, swinging his gun toward Williams. "I'm your commanding officer." "Not anymore, you're not," Williams replied grimly. A commanding officer who commits treason against his own country and his own men forfeits any claim to loyalty or obedience. The moment stretched unbearably as Morrison's desperate eyes darted between the faces surrounding him, searching for any sign of support or sympathy. Finding none, he seemed to reach some internal breaking point that pushed him beyond rational thought. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking some of you with me." But Morrison had underestimated the reflexes of people who lived daily with mortal danger. As his finger tightened on the trigger, Silas dove toward Ayana, while Red Elk's warriors moved. With the fluid precision of men who had trained for exactly this type of situation their entire lives, the gunshot that followed echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. But Morrison's aim had been spoiled by Sergeant Williams, who had tackled his captain from behind just as the weapon discharged. The bullet went high and wide, embedding itself harmlessly in the adobe wall of Silas's cabin. In the chaos that followed, Morrison found himself disarmed and restrained by his own men, who had finally seen enough of his corruption and cowardice to take decisive action. His protests and threats fell on deaf ears as the soldiers secured him with the same efficiency they would have used on any other prisoner. As order was restored, Ayana carefully collected the scattered papers and returned them to her pouch. The evidence against Morrison was comprehensive and damning, representing months of dangerous work by Apache agents who had risked their lives to expose the truth about territorial corruption. "What happens now?" Silas asked, still somewhat stunned by the rapid turn of events. "Now justice takes its course," Red Elk replied. "Captain Morrison will face trial for his crimes, and the illegal mining operations will be shut down. My people will retain their traditional lands, at least for now." Sergeant Williams approached the group with obvious relief written on his weathered features. "I want to apologize for what happened here today," he said to Red Elk. "Most of us in the service aren't like Morrison. We just want to do our duty and serve with honor." Red Elk clasped the sergeant's hand in the traditional grip of warriors acknowledging mutual respect. "I know this, Sergeant. Good men exist in all peoples. The challenge is learning to recognize them and work together, despite the corruption of those who would profit from our conflicts." As the cavalry patrol prepared to escort their disgraced captain back to face military justice, Silas found himself contemplating the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them all to this moment. A simple act of rescue had led to revelations that would reshape the political landscape of the entire territory. The turquoise bracelet on his wrist caught the afternoon light, reminding him that sometimes the smallest gestures of human kindness could trigger consequences far beyond imagination. He had saved one life at Dead Mule Wash, but in doing so, he had helped expose corruption that threatened the lives and freedom of thousands. The aftermath of Morrison's arrest brought an unexpected calm to Silas's canyon, but beneath the surface, deeper currents of change were stirring. As Sergeant Williams prepared his patrol for the return journey with their prisoner, Red Elk drew Silas aside for a conversation that would define the next chapter of both their lives. "The danger is not over," the chief said quietly, his weathered face grave with concern. "Morrison was a tool, not the source of the corruption. His arrest will alert others in the conspiracy that their activities have been discovered. They will seek to eliminate evidence and witnesses." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. "You're saying they'll come after you and Ayana?" "They will come after all of us," Red Elk corrected. "You are now part of this, whether you chose to be or not. Your cabin has been identified as a meeting place. Your character as someone willing to stand with Apache people against injustice. In their eyes, that makes you an enemy to be eliminated." The weight of this reality settled on Silas like a heavy blanket. His carefully constructed solitary life was not just changed, it was finished. There could be no return to anonymous safety after what had transpired here. He had crossed a line that made neutrality impossible. Ayana approached them, moving with the silent grace that Silas now understood came from years of intelligence work in dangerous territory. In her hands, she carried something that made his breath catch, a war shirt of magnificent beauty and obvious ceremonial importance. The shirt was made from the softest buckskin Silas had ever seen, dyed a rich golden brown that seemed to capture and hold the fading sunlight. Across the chest and shoulders, intricate beadwork told a story in symbols and patterns that spoke of great deeds and honored ancestors. Eagle feathers and silver ornaments adorned the garment, marking it as something reserved for the highest occasions and most respected individuals. This belonged to my grandfather, the chief, who led our people through the Great Migration 40 years ago. Red Elk explained as Ayanna held the shirt toward Silas. It has been worn only by those who proved themselves worthy of our deepest trust and respect. Silas stared at the magnificent garment, understanding instinctively that he was being offered something far more valuable than clothing. This was acceptance into the heart of Apache culture, recognition as someone worthy of their most sacred honors. It was also, he realized, a calling to a different kind of life than he had ever imagined. "I'm honored," he said carefully, "but I'm not sure I've earned such a gift." "You earned it the moment you chose to stand between Morrison's gun and my daughter," Red Elk replied firmly. "But more than that, you earned it by choosing to see Apache people as human beings, worthy of respect, rather than problems to be solved. In these times, such men are rarer than water in the deep desert." Ayanna spoke in Apache, her words clearly formal and ritualistic. Red Elk translated with obvious pride. "She says that you have proven yourself a protector of the innocent and a friend to justice. She asks if you will accept the responsibility that comes with wearing the shirt of a war chief." The magnitude of what was being offered hit Silas like a physical blow. They weren't just giving him a beautiful garment, they were offering him a place in their world, a role in their struggle for survival and justice. It would mean abandoning his solitary existence forever, accepting obligations and loyalties that would reshape every aspect of his remaining years. But as he looked at the faces around him, Red Elk's dignified strength, Ayanna's intelligence and courage, even Sergeant Williams's growing respect for these remarkable people, Silas realized that his choice had already been made. It had been made the moment he threw his rope to a drowning woman, and everything since had simply been the unfolding of consequences he could never have foreseen. "I accept," he said quietly, "and I understand what it means." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Silas had ever experienced. Red Elk spoke prayers in Apache while Ayanna helped Silas into the war shirt, her touch gentle but reverent as she adjusted the sacred garment to fit his broader frame. The other Apache warriors joined in the ritual, their voices creating a harmony that seemed to connect the small gathering to generations of ancestors and the vast sweep of desert landscape around them. When the ceremony was complete, Silas looked down at himself in amazement. The war shirt transformed him, making him feel both humbled by its significance and strengthened by its symbolism. He was no longer just Silas Boone, solitary mountain man. He was now something new, a bridge between worlds, a protector of justice, a man with obligations that extended far beyond his own survival. But even as he accepted this new identity, danger was already moving toward them across the desert. Morrison's arrest had indeed triggered desperate actions by his co-conspirators, and by morning, Silas's canyon would be under siege by men who would stop at nothing to eliminate the evidence and the witnesses that threatened their illegal empire. Dawn broke gray and ominous over Silas's canyon, bringing with it the sound that confirmed Red Elk's warnings about continuing danger. The thunder of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, but this time there was nothing ceremonial or peaceful about the riders heading their way. These were hard men on a deadly mission, and they were coming fast. Silas counted at least 15 riders as they appeared on the eastern ridge. Too many to be a regular patrol and moving with too much purpose to be casual travelers. At their head rode a figure he recognized with growing dread, Marcus Kellerman, one of the most ruthless mining speculators in the territory, and, according to the evidence Ayanna had gathered, Morrison's primary partner in the conspiracy. Kellerman was everything Morrison had aspired to be: wealthy, connected, and completely without conscience when it came to achieving his goals. He had built his fortune on the suffering of others, using his political connections and hired gunmen to claim mineral rights through intimidation and fraud. If he was here personally, it meant the stakes were higher than Silas had realized. "They've come to eliminate the evidence," Red Elk said grimly as he studied the approaching force through Silas's field glasses. "And everyone who has seen it." The Apache chief's assessment was confirmed when Kellerman's men spread out along the rim of the canyon in a classic siege formation. These weren't soldiers bound by military regulations. They were hired killers who would follow orders without question if the price was right. The territorial authorities would later be told that Apache raiders had attacked and killed everyone in the canyon, leaving no witnesses to contradict the official story. But Red Elk and his warriors had not survived decades of conflict by being unprepared for exactly this type of situation. With quiet efficiency, they transformed Silas's peaceful canyon into a fortress, using every natural advantage the terrain provided while positioning themselves for maximum defensive effectiveness. Silas found himself caught up in preparations he had never imagined needing. His simple cabin became the central strongpoint, its thick adobe walls capable of stopping rifle bullets. The spring that provided his water was secured and protected, ensuring they couldn't be forced out by thirst. Supply caches were established in hidden positions throughout the canyon, giving them multiple fallback positions if the main defensive line was overrun. "You fight like a man born to war," Red Elk observed as Silas helped position rocks to create better firing positions. "But this is not the life you chose." "Maybe it's the life that chose me," Silas replied, surprising himself with the calmness in his voice. "Either way, I'm here now and I'm not running." The war shirt he wore seemed to give him strength and clarity he had never possessed before. The sacred garment connected him to generations of Apache warriors who had faced impossible odds with courage and dignity. He was no longer fighting just for his own survival. He was defending a principle that transcended individual lives. Ayana approached them carrying something that made both men's eyes widen with surprise. From her seemingly endless collection of concealed items, she had produced a military telegraph key and a compact battery pack that could power it for hours. The implications were staggering. She had been prepared to send messages from his remote canyon all along. "The territorial governor needs to know what's happening." "Here," she explained as she quickly assembled the telegraph equipment with practiced skill. "If we can hold out until help arrives, Kellerman's entire operation will be exposed." But help was hours away at best, and Kellerman's men were already moving into position for an assault. The first shots rang out as sharpshooters on the canyon rim tried to pin down the defenders, while the main force prepared to descend into the canyon. The siege of Silas's peaceful retreat had begun in earnest. The battle that followed tested every skill Silas had learned in his 57 years of frontier life. His knowledge of the canyon's every rock and shadow proved invaluable as he moved between defensive positions, using terrain he had memorized over decades to stay one step ahead of Kellerman's gunmen. The Apache warriors fought with a fluid coordination that spoke of lifelong training, turning the canyon into a deadly maze for their attackers. But it was Ayana who proved most crucial to their defense. Between sending urgent telegraph messages to territorial authorities, she directed defensive fire with tactical expertise that rivaled any military officer. Her intelligence work had given her detailed knowledge of Kellerman's methods and the capabilities of his hired gunmen, allowing her to anticipate their moves and counter them effectively. As the morning wore on and the battle intensified, Silas realized that this confrontation was about far more than their immediate survival. This was the moment when decades of injustice and corruption would finally face judgment, when the evidence gathered at such great risk would either see the light of day or be buried forever, along with those who had died to obtain it. The outcome would determine not just their individual fates, but the future of Apache-white relations throughout the territory and the possibility that justice could triumph over greed and prejudice. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains when the sound of approaching cavalry horns echoed across the desert, bringing salvation to the embattled defenders of Silas's canyon. Iyana's telegraph messages had reached their destination, and the territorial governor had responded with overwhelming force. 2 full companies of soldiers riding hard from the territorial capital. Kellerman's hired gunmen, caught between the canyon's defenders and the approaching cavalry, found their situation suddenly untenable. The mining speculator himself, watching his carefully planned elimination of witnesses turn into a disaster that would expose him to federal prosecution, made the desperate decision to flee rather than face capture. But his escape was short-lived. Red Elk's warriors, moving with the silent efficiency that had made them legendary, intercepted him before he could reach the canyon rim. The siege ended not with a climactic battle, but with the simple reality that justice, when properly armed and determined, was more powerful than corruption. Kellerman and his surviving gunmen found themselves in military custody, facing charges that would end their criminal enterprise forever. The evidence that Iyana had risked her life to gather would now see the light of day in territorial courts. As order was restored and the immediate danger passed, Silas found himself standing beside Red Elk on the porch of his cabin, watching the cavalry process their prisoners. The war shirt he wore felt natural now, as if it had always been part of him. The solitary mountain man who had awakened that morning was gone forever, replaced by someone with broader obligations and deeper connections to the world around him. "It's finished," Red Elk said quietly. But Silas heard both satisfaction and sadness in the chief's voice. "The corruption is exposed, the guilty will face justice, and my people will keep their lands for now. But this victory comes with a price. The old ways of avoiding conflict are no longer possible." Silas understood what the chief meant. The events of the past days had forced all of them into the open, making them visible to forces both good and evil that operated beyond the desert's boundaries. There could be no return to the simple life of avoiding entanglement with the broader world's problems. Iyana approached them, her intelligence work finally complete. She carried with her a small leather pouch, different from the beaded ones she had used before, this one plain and practical, clearly meant for everyday use rather than ceremony. Inside, Silas could see, were personal items, photographs, letters, small mementos that spoke of a life lived far from the desert. "I must return to the territorial capital," she explained, her voice carrying both regret and resolve. "The governor has asked me to serve as an official liaison between the Apache tribes and the territorial government. It's an opportunity to prevent future conflicts through understanding rather than force." The position she described was unprecedented. A native woman serving in an official governmental role, bridging 2 worlds that had known only conflict for generations. It was a chance to shape policy from within the system, rather than fighting it from outside. But it would require her to leave behind the traditional life of her people. Red Elk placed a gentle hand on his daughter's shoulder, his pride evident despite the pain of separation. "You have grown beyond what I could have imagined when you were born," he said softly. "Your mother would be proud of the woman you have become." But it was what Iyana said next that surprised Silas most. "I want Silas to come with me. The territorial government needs advisors who understand both cultures, men who have proven their honor and integrity." His voice could help shape policies that respect both people's rights. The offer hung in the desert air, like a challenge to everything Silas had believed about his own capabilities and desires. A month ago, he had been a hermit who wanted nothing more than to be left alone. Now he was being asked to help govern a territory, to use his experience and newfound understanding to bridge the gap between cultures that seemed destined for eternal conflict. "I'm just a mountain man," Silas protested. though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were no longer entirely true. "I don't know anything about politics or government." "You know about justice," Red Elk replied firmly. "You know about treating people with dignity regardless of their race or culture. You know about standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous. These are the qualities that matter most in leadership." As the days that followed brought official recognition of their heroism and formal requests for their continued service, Silas found himself contemplating a future he had never imagined. The territorial governor offered him a position as special advisor on frontier relations, with authority to investigate conflicts and recommend solutions based on his unique experience with both cultures. The decision, when it finally came, felt as natural as breathing. Standing in his canyon one last time before departing for the territorial capital, Silas touched the turquoise bracelet that still adorned his wrist, the simple gift that had started this extraordinary journey. Sometimes a single act of kindness really could change everything, creating ripples that spread far beyond their initial impact. 3 months later, Silas Boone sat in a comfortable office in Santa Fe, wearing his Apache war shirt over frontier clothes as he reviewed reports from across the territory. On his desk lay the tools of his new trade: official documents, maps of tribal lands, correspondence from chiefs and governors who had learned to trust his judgment. But nearby, carefully preserved in a place of honor, sat his father's trapping journal, the turquoise bracelet, and the eagle feather that had marked the beginning of his transformation. The hermit who had wanted only solitude had become a bridge between worlds, proving that sometimes life's greatest adventures begin not with seeking them out, but with simple willingness to help a stranger in need. In saving one life at Dead Mule Wash, Silas had discovered a purpose larger than himself, and in the process had helped save many more lives through the power of understanding and justice. Outside his window, the New Mexico sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, reminding him daily that some things, beauty, honor, the possibility of redemption, remained constant no matter how much the world around them changed.